because I really didn't know any better. So I really think until I came to the U.S., my childhood, it was kind of almost idyllic. It was slightly fantastic.
Yeah. When I use the phrase DP, I'm not necessarily describing a life of deprivation. It is simply that your horizons are bounded by a certain aspects.
Environment,
And also the lack of agency. You're the sort of person who, the bus stops or somebody's swindling you or something, and you don't have that sort of feeling that the law is going to stand behind you or that you're of such a high social position that you can do something. And so there's that slight downtrodden feeling that I think comes from being, after all, moved from one place to another. It's not as though you could just come here if you wanted to.
Acceptance.
Acceptance. So that's, I think, the acceptance of life being out of your control seems to me a DP thing. So it doesn't necessarily be miserable.
No, I agree. I completely agree. I think that was my point. Rather than that I have this sort of...
So it could be paradise, but you were still forced into paradise by someone else.
Yes.
So how many DP camps total were you in? 10, perhaps?
Yeah, maybe about a dozen from the end of the war. It's interesting. My mother and, the Latvian involvement with war, it was very complicated. Even my family's involvement, I'm not really quite certain. But in 1944, the war is sort of lost in, I think the Germans are in Latvia, actually, anyway. My mother and the Russians had been there before, for a whole year, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right.
And the Russians were horrible. They deported like 20,000 people in one night to Siberia. So when the Germans came later, they were seen as sort of liberators. It's hard to believe.
It could be worse.
But I say that to Americans especially because there's that kind of, they look at things as sort of stereotypical and kind of, they can't believe it. But anyway, somehow, and then of course a lot of Latvians they were drafted into the army or into the legions, and they were sent to like labor camps in Germany. My mother and grandmother, in 1944 in August, because they realized that the Russians are coming back and they're really scared, for good reason. I am just less than 2 years old, and my mother is pregnant with my sister. So they decide to go to Germany, and they arrange to work somewhere, and they don't really know where. So one morning they pack all their belongings, like clothes and stuff, are in 2 pillowcases, because that's all they can take. My mother's pregnant, my grandmother is here. And I think my grandmother is probably carrying me.
Is this your mother's mother?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And they have these 2 pillowcases, and they walk from Riga to the boat, to the ship. In the middle of the war, they go and take this big passenger ship. Because the Germans were shipping people back and forth, like injured soldiers and all of that, across the Baltic, back to Germany. And I think they had signed up to work or something. My mother and grandmother did. So they took them like a month to go from Danzig to Wuppertal, where they're supposed to be working. So remember, she's pregnant, like 8 months, in the middle of the war, and bombs are falling. And I'm probably screaming because my ears are infected. So they end up working in a factory where they make telecommunications devices for fighter planes, from one fighter to another. And they work in this factory in the mountains, in the Ruhr, which is then covered with the Red Cross, indicating that it's a hospital. And they worked there until the end of the war, and even while she was working there, my mother gave birth to my sister. And of course we have all kinds of stories about that. And then as a result, because they were considered sort of like slave laborers, laborers today. I don't think they really were. The German government gave them pensions even when they were living here in the U.S.
That's
for
good.
that time.
Uh-huh.
You know, the Germans paid all the,
Reparation kind of.
no, for example, anybody whose relatives were lost, were killed, by Jews especially, were killed in the camps, they would actually pay their offspring. I had a friend who was getting $200 a month because a Hungarian Jew was killed in Auschwitz. So, something you said made me think of that, and that's why I don't want to bore you with
No,
this.
you're not boring. You never are.
But actually, you know, I haven't really thought about this until I started talking to you about it. Then I've been actually thinking a lot more myself, walking, going to work.
Walking is very good.
Yeah. Oh,